Thank you very much, all of you. I'm here just to introduce Tim. Actually, for Tim and me, this is a very special day because there has been a bit of ambiguity. The two of us are not completely sure who is the president of International Economic Association, because we didn't know the exact point of transition, whether it's today, tomorrow, or yesterday. So you know it's one of the two of us. So it could be the president-elect introducing the president, or the president-elect president introducing the past president. You'll have to live with that ambiguity. Before I introduce Tim, and I'll do it very informally and briefly, I just wanted to say one or two words about iEA and the organization of this particular World Congress. The iEA is a special organization because it straddles the world of research and the world of policy in a way that very few organizations do. In pure research, there are some fantastic organizations with members, most of them centered in US and Europe. And in terms of pure policy, there are actually wonderful institutions and organizations, large number of them in Washington, where I had lived for several years. But this straddling of bringing research to the world of policy, the best of research, there are very few. And there is a special responsibility because research is in some ways integrity. You want to bring the best of data, best of statistics, fine reasoning, and hold the policymaker accountable. And the policymakers, there are good ones who want to do it right, but there are pressures to respond to various demands, so you distort things. The best reminder of this, the importance of doing things right, is a satirical observation in a British magazine that I had read donkeys years ago, where the magazine said that American journalists make a complete fetish of checking and double-checking every fact. Whereas in Britain, the newspapers and magazines are so exciting because we believe that some facts are just too good to be checked. And that's the spirit in which, in this case, of course, it's done jocularly, the remark, but in the case of policy, it happens often enough. If you straddle the two worlds, you will see, you take the facts, you distort it slightly to play to your partisan interest. So it is important, the responsibility that we have from this organization, bringing the best of research, best of ideas, and in some sense holding policymakers accountable, making it a bit more difficult for them to pick and choose what they want to pick and choose. The other thing which makes this very special is it's an international body. We try to reach out to the whole world, to developing countries in a very big way, emerging economies, the rich advanced economies, all together on a common platform. And this I say because I think it's important, and I keep repeating, that the world is a small place. It's becoming smaller by technology, and it's a bit of a pity that the narrower human identities are becoming so strong today. And this kind of a community and a group like the International Organization also plays a very important role by reminding us that someone who speaks a bit differently, the accent is a bit different, looks a bit different, fundamentally we are very, very similar creatures. For one thing, we all come from Africa. So there is a commonness that the organization is a reminder. And that also we have to keep it up as the world goes the way it seems to be going. A few words just of thanks I have to say about iEA. I've done that, and I'm not going to be elaborating on this at all. It has been a lot of work, and I have to say very, very satisfying to see how well the conference has gone. Well, there's one more day. So by tomorrow's end, I hope we will all be able to say that it's been a wonderful conference. I wish I could feel good about the fact that I've shouldered a huge amount of work. There has been work, but really nowhere near what a whole lot of others have taken on. Tim, first of all, about iEA as an organization, I'm still a complete amateur. My focus was entirely on the program. It is Tim that every time I would have to turn to on various details, so that he was shouldering. Organization of this particular Congress, disproportionately, it's Andrea Cavallo who's here, took on responsibility. So it was a one point through which, and very often if you don't have a single point where you can check on everything, it gets very difficult. So you send messages, emails, it's Andrea who's on top of everything. Thank you very much, Andrea. And of course, with the office bearers, I've been working with Omar Licandro, Eric Bergloff. There have been phone calls back and forth. Danny Roderick is going to get into this as the president-elect is going to get involved. So I won't thank him just as yet, but as he gets more involved, there will be occasion to do that. Then after I mentioned about this Congress, Andrea, but immediately after that, I have to say, it's the local committee played a huge amount of role. And this, because I was following it closely, you can see the number of things you have to pay attention to. I was not paying attention to, but I could see that someone is doing that for everything to go on in such an organized fashion. Fausto, Kanishka, Susan, Alejandro took on this responsibility entirely, and there are many volunteers who were supporting them, made that also possible. I will not name the program committee, it's a long program committee, but that's the committee that has done a lot of work in terms of the intellectual content of this conference. And there were individuals with whom I was going back and forth because there was a particular paper causing a problem, particular session causing a problem, and virtually everyone there were given bunches of papers to read, comment, grade, etc. So a huge amount of help from them as well. Thank you very much, all of you, for all this help. Tim Besley. Just a few personal words. You know, when I joined the World Bank in 2012, it's a kind of perverse interest that we human beings have. I wanted to know if I was the first choice of the World Bank for this job. I shouldn't have done research on that. I started doing research and discovered that I was at least the second choice, because Tim was the first choice who hadn't taken it. Now, that is Tim. Our paths have crisscrossed several times, and now, of course, over iEA. My first introduction, Tim, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, was maybe 1990 when Tim was in Princeton, and I was a visiting professor at Princeton that we got to know each other. Since then, we've actually, paths have overlapped a lot. And when I was at the World Bank, there was a very important committee was set up to evaluate DEC and how DEC should function. And I worked on that, got Tim to be the chair of that committee. And it's a mammoth, very, very professional report, actually. It was quintessentially Tim, just put in all the effort into producing a fine report. I just hope the World Bank is going to use it and take those ideas from there further forward. Tim is the school professor at the London School of Economics. He served on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, vitally important committee, and his work, huge amount of body of work as an economist, is extremely well known. I'm not going to talk about that. Very, very distinguished economist. So it's for me a great pleasure and honor taking on the job after Tim. And Tim, welcome for your speech.
Thank you very much, Kaushik, and I've got to say it's such a pleasure to be handing the baton to someone who I admire so much, both as a person and as an economist. And thank you for those very kind words. So for my presidential address, I'm going to talk about this topic of institutional dynamics and cultural evolution. And I think to some extent it fits very much into the pattern of the really superb plenaries that we've had through the Congress so far, and I hope I don't lower the standard. Perhaps the topic is a bit, or the title is a bit mysterious, so I'll talk about what I think are the core elements here that we care about, and why I think this is an important topic to talk about. I think it's fair to say that when we talk about the things that drive differences in long-run development now, compared to a quarter of a century ago, and picking an arbitrary time period here, much more weight is now placed on the importance of organizational structures and institutional dynamics as a way of explaining the way the world has evolved and the way we think the world could change in the future. And in the field which I have been privileged to be involved in over that period, the field of political economy, I think it's helped to sharpen many insights into comparative development, using the tools of political economy and thinking about how it can contribute. But I think as the agenda has progressed, it's become clear that one of the really challenging issues is how to think about the dynamics of institutions and organizations, the way they change, what is subject to architectural or planned change, and what happens as more as a sort of an autonomous dynamic, and how do we think about those dynamics. And economists have risen to that challenge, and the general approach, and I'm going to come back to this as I develop my thinking, has been to use approaches based on looking at the interests of those who have control over organizational rules or the power to change in a kind of strategic way, thinking about the strategic pursuit of objectives. Under the assumption, I mean, you would say it was the classic or standard economic assumption, the objectives that people have are fixed. I mean, they may evolve with economic factors, but rarely have they been allowed to change in other ways. So fixed preferences, typically self-interested preferences, has been for most of the period of post-war economics the kind of standard way to think about organizations and institutions. So today what I want to introduce is some thinking about how bringing in dynamics of values might be helpful to thinking about these questions. And before I do that, though, I kind of want to just step back a little bit and frame the issues I care about through thinking about what I would call sort of 5 phases of policy thinking. It's a little bit autobiographical because these are sort of my 5 phases of policy thinking, but I do think they correspond to genuine trends in the economics profession. I'm kind of at an age now where I constantly try and think of the advantages of growing older, and one of them is certainly you can see change within your own discipline in real time, having had a longer career. So these 5 phases, the last one is with a question mark, and is the one I'm going to talk about today. I think characterize what has been some of the challenges in policy economics. And people often ask me, by the way, when I start a casual conversation with someone, I say, what field of economics do you work in? I find that question incredibly hard to answer, whether I can sometimes say political economy, I might even dare to say development, though I'm probably not that much in tune with the thrust of the contemporary development field. Sometimes I might say public economics. But actually the unifying thing in all of what I've done forever has been to worry about policy, both what good policy is and where it comes from. The normative approach was the one I was schooled in. For those who don't know, I was both an undergraduate and a graduate student in Oxford, where when I was there, the 2 most influential figures were probably Jim Mirrlees and Amartya Sen. And really, I think it's fair to say, I would never have become an economist had I not had the privilege of attending Amartya's undergraduate lectures, which were truly Olympian. I mean, he began with Aristotle and ended with Arrow. I mean, it was really something amazing to see, and the arguments that came out in the depth and the breadth of the subject. But it was more Jim Mirrlees who was the kind of discipline on all this to a point. And those of us who studied public economics in particular in that environment were basically taught what I would call the normative approach to public policy making. And basically the approach goes, I don't think I need to introduce you to it, you'll all know it, that we think of the way that the power of government can be used to make the economy either more productive or more equitable. And what comes out of that is that we want to provide infrastructure, education, healthcare, and we want to fix market failures, and we want to provide security in establishing property rights. So it's fair to say when I was taught public economics, those topics, that's why I put them in parentheses, were relatively little talked about. There was a kind of presumption that government just did that, and then it was the stuff over and above that that was the kind of stuff we mainly studied. And then what did you do? You sort of tried to study the design of optimal interventions based on some kind of welfare economic framework, which was typically utilitarian, although at the time Amartya, as he has always been, was quite critical of some aspects of that framework, but actually in the way policy economics was done, that was largely in that utilitarian tradition. And of course that gave way to fields like cost-benefit analysis, which are enormously powerful in international institutions, particularly the World Bank, as a tool of implementing this kind of applied normative approach. In the way it was taught, and even the way it was discussed, certainly where I was brought up, there was almost no reference to the role of organizations or institutions in policy. There was a kind of view that policy was good, and you had to design what the policy was, and then the policy would somehow emerge from some rational government process. And government was very much not really modeled at all. It was sort of as a sort of an exogenous player outside of the economic system, identifying, and then you thought of, well, what was that story? It was government, it was institutions like the World Bank that were upholding this model of benevolent government. And that was largely how I was schooled. And if you'd asked me what my career would have been at the point I graduated with my PhD, I would have said the next years of my life are going to be making contributions to try and make this framework work even better than those who have been my mentors. And I thought that was the future of economics. We could do even better, and we could design optimal policy, and we could change the world, and we could make it a better place, more equitable and more productive if we only did so. In fact, relatively little of what I've done, I certainly haven't failed in that mission entirely, but by and large, that's not been the route that my career has taken. And by a very strange twist of fate, someone once asked me, well, how did I get interested in political economy? Well, there's a very, very simple story here, which is actually true, has the virtue of being true. But I was in India with my great friend Anne Case, and we were doing some field work, and we were planning to do more field work in Hyderabad, near Hyderabad in Andhra Pradesh. And it relied on us having a driver pick us up at the guest house we were staying in and take us out to a field site. One day, the driver didn't show up. And we said, well, what's happened? Well, the car has broken down. It turned out, and our Indian friends here will get this, what was wrong with the car? The horn doesn't work. It turned out the car was off the road if it didn't have a functional horn. Anyway, so here were Anne and I abandoned in a guest house. And so I just happened to say to Anne, what are you working on? And she said, well, Marty Feldstein has asked me to write a paper for some conference, and I think it might have something to do, I might have to do something to do with political economy. And I said, that sounds interesting. So we sat down for a day, and she explained what she was working on. And actually that became what was my first paper in political economy, which came out in the American Economic Review in 1995, was this joint paper with Anne Case that came out of that conversation, which would only have happened if the car's horn had been working. Heaven knows what would have happened instead. But it also fitted in very much into a sort of sense of angst I was already having, and I think many economists were having, about the limits of that normative, benevolent model view of government. And it was pretty evident to all of us, I think, who thought about how policy actually happened, that the prescriptions of that model frequently were not the things that happened in real-world government. And of course, we've been far from the people who had that insight, and I'll talk a little bit about a hero in that regard, who I think has been neglected by the modern political economy, namely James Buchanan. But the idea of government failure then became salient and was already out there. I say, far from me to claim that was something that I was responsible for studying. But I think it's fair to say that in that mainstream normative policy analysis, it was really very little attention was paid to those ideas. And what became clear when you began to unpack the possibility that there was a real decision-making process that required people that were both competent and benevolent to carry it out is that you still needed a normative benchmark. You needed to know where you were trying to get, but you could kind of begin or try to begin to understand the distortions that prevented you from getting there. And you know, whether these were failures of equity, failures of efficiency, or failures of selection. This was something that's become a lot more salient and actually relevant in the political economy literature. The question of who's making the decisions. We tend to think of the world, or often think of the world in a very disembodied way. It's just about getting the rules right, but actually having the right people be in there making the decisions, whether it's an issue of competence or an issue of motivation, I think is very important. Now this had been in an earlier phase, and most of you will recognize this, the preoccupation of the early public choice literature. But that has kind of emerged as a sort of counterculture. I mean, there had been overlaps and connections with the rest of the mainstream economics profession, but by and large, it had emerged among a group of people, typically at the University of Virginia and various other institutions later, with around the work of Buchanan and Tullock and people who they had produced, particularly as graduate students. Now, what was interesting about that to me when I began to read it, because I realized that even most people today who are interested in political economy don't read that stuff, is just how much it was rooted in normative economics. I mean, although I didn't subscribe to many of the things that I think Buchanan was saying, it was very clear he saw the issue of institution design and the issue of providing a framework for policy making as the pursuit of some set of normative goals. So he wasn't rejecting in any way, shape, or form the normative model. What he was trying to do is saying, these guys who advocate optimal policy have just been incredibly naive, both in the way they've thought about this happening, and we really need to study that process more. So I was very much more comfortable in some ways than the guys who just were entirely positivist and just said, oh, I like to study, you know, median voter theorems or whatever it would be because I want to understand politics. I thought the much more interesting question was how did the distortions that you might have in the political process lead to some deviation from the normative ideal, that allowed us to think of in a particular way about the reason why we want to study public political resource allocation and to find sources of government failure, but not just to use that to beat the government over the head, but also to try and develop a theory, and this was what I thought would be my phase 2 research of kind of comparative institutional design, and then instead of saying we want optimal policies, we would sort of say we wanted optimal institutions. I should add one thing. I barely ever met Buchanan, even though he was a hero of mine, but I was strangely invited to his 93rd birthday conference. Out of the blue, I got this invitation. Why was 93? But there was a very distinguished gathering of particularly people who worked in the public choice area, and you know, I wasn't sure, was I there, you know, by accident? They just sort of got my name wrong. It was meant to invite someone. But eventually I got to talk to Buchanan. And my only interaction with Buchanan, this guy who I thought was this really important thinker, was he acknowledged my presence and he shook my hand. And he said, he clearly knew. I said, I've read your work. And that was the end of it. He walked off. And I never to this day thought that was paying me a big compliment. But anyway, I'll never know, sadly. But anyway, it was a wonderful conference, and for me it gave me an opportunity to at least be inside the tent, albeit rather briefly. One thing that kind of though came in the phase 3 was really beginning to realize, and again, far from taking the credit for this, there were a number of people working on important projects where this became a feature of what we were all doing. That you really didn't get the proper sources of government failure unless you were willing to study dynamic models. In other words, the big cost to the economy that you would have by having political misallocation were likely to come from the failures of public investment or fiscal management or market regulation, whose consequences were not sort of one period consequences. These were things that were going to have an impact on the economy going forward and therefore could potentially magnify considerably the costs of political distortions. And people began to develop models of those ideas of different kinds. And what we learned is that the process of political replacement is a very important intermediation. If you study dynamics, you have a policymaker, and that policymaker has to take a forward-looking decision, has to invest in infrastructure or whatever it might be. And one thing, if you take a classic economic reasoning, is that policymaker is going to, that decision is going to be intertwined with the policymaker's probability of still being the policymaker in some future period. So if you model people in a classic economically rational way, things don't happen or might not happen if that political replacement process is particularly unfavorable. And there are stories around leaders who decided they didn't want to invest in roads because they feared that those roads would only lead to a political uprising as people came to the capital to displace the leader, which would be a kind of limiting case of an adverse political replacement effect. But with Torsten Persson, I began, though, to think about this in a slightly different way, and we developed this agenda where we thought that one of the interesting aspects of this was not just the sort of classic public investments or classic macroeconomic management issues, but actually how the state chose to invest or chooses to invest in making the state itself work better. And this is important if you believe in the normative model. Because if you think that ultimately we want to get to a place where we could have the normative model, we could have the governments that actually behave according to that model, presumably those governments have to be equipped with the capacities to deliver. And that could be in the form of raising tax revenue, it could be in the form of knowing how to provide health services or education effectively. And so a big investment problem in the state, and when you begin to unpack this, you see all sorts of historical examples, was the investment in state capacities. And one idea that leapt out very clearly from that research program, which ended up in a book but is in some ways still an ongoing program, is that the way you create the best environment for investment in state capacity comes from having a political system where government is in a sense not forced but in equilibrium chooses to use that state capacity you've created for the common good. Because then you'll generate a kind of consensus around the role of government. It may be true that it's not like you need sort of peace and harmony to break out and everyone to agree on everything, but what you need is a core set of priorities of government that are broadly consensual. And if you can achieve that through the design of political institutions, and the term we used was cohesive institutions, then you're going to have two advantages. Not only do you get these investments because now there's a sense of common purpose, but also you cut through the political replacement effect. Because the power of incumbency to shape policy is limited. And of course that links back to a lot of themes in political philosophy and political thinking, that you need constrained government to have effective government. And this gave us a way of thinking about why having certain forms of constrained government would give rise to stronger government, not weaker government, through these dynamic investments in state capacity. And we kind of developed those ideas. But again, I want to emphasize for us, or for me, perhaps less for Torsten, but certainly for me, this was trying to think about how to make the normative model relevant again, by now saying we can design both the institutions and give the government the capacity to carry through the kind of agenda that we thought in the normative project was a good one. But of course, that begs another question. So suppose you believe me. Suppose you believe that these cohesive institutions, which we typically measure as some form of constraints on executive authority, either through legal institutions or parliamentary institutions, suppose that is the answer. Well, that only raises an even bigger puzzle. Why doesn't everyone have it? Just as you might have had a puzzle around why governments don't choose the normative model, you have an even bigger puzzle, normative policy, you have an even bigger puzzle around why they don't choose the right institutions. You have to confront the theory of institutional dynamics. And perhaps develop a theory of institutional failure that might parallel the theory of government failure as applied to policy. And the obvious thing to do, and this is what people who began to study this did at the time, was to say, well, let's apply the economic model to institution design, and that means thinking about strategic decisions over institutions by forward-looking actors. And the way you maintain those institutions is by having some form of balance of power, whereby if a government decides not to implement the kinds of institutions that others in society would desire, that there's some process of either protest or revolution or coup or whatever you want to model that would lead to the institutional change that we see. And that's kind of the starting point for today's talk. So maybe if I've been convinced that's a successful project, everything else I'm going to say from now on I wouldn't be talking about. But I think that project has not delivered, and it hasn't delivered in a number of dimensions that I'll try and explain to you. Because I don't really think it explains institutional dynamics of the kind we see in the world that compellingly. And I'm going to show you some data on dynamics of institutions in a minute, and suggest to you that perhaps we need to add something else. And that's this phase 5 project that I described to you, which is, I guess, where I am now, which is trying to bring in a role for culture. And that's what I want to talk about for the rest of my time. Of course, culture and economics has a sort of hot and cold relationship with economics, meaning that, although mostly cold, I would say, that occasionally there are a few people who are willing to engage with those issues. Indeed, I would say many economists are just deeply suspicious about invoking cultural explanations of anything, and I think with good reason. So if you go back and read what was written in the 19th century about Japan's prospects, you will find that's full, particularly by sociologists, of accounts saying that Japanese society is fundamentally unsuited to capitalist development, that the norms and culture are just not compatible, and therefore, there's no future for the Japanese economy. And you only have to read things like that to say, well, this sounds like not really a very helpful thing. So why do economists think that? They tend to think that these explanations are then just too cheap, they're trite, but also you can just say anything once you're allowed to invoke culture. I just have to say, if this economy isn't working well, it just has a bad culture, so let's write it off and there's not a lot we can say. Well, I think what's exciting and what I want to persuade you today, there is stuff we can say, and there is stuff we can say in a relatively constrained way of the kind that economic modeling can contribute to. And I'm going to just illustrate that in a specific context, in this context of thinking about the dynamics of political institutions in a moment. And the other thing to point out, and this is absolutely essential, is culture. You need theories of culture that are dynamic. I mean, all the cultural anthropologists who studied this have observed these cultural dynamics that societies really do change over time. You don't often have the kind of large N studies or even large T studies that we would crave, but there's no question or doubt that you have to model the dynamics for this to be a serious enterprise. There's two broad approaches that economists have taken who have dabbled in the dark art. The first, which I think of the economist's safe space, is modeling culture as equilibrium play in a repeated game. You can sort of do it without having to sacrifice anything standard. You can just say that we're going to model beliefs or equilibrium play in a certain way, and we'll say this society that's playing the equilibrium this way has a culture that's different from a society that plays the game another way. And I'm not going to disparage that. That's a perfectly legitimate way to enter this. But I've been kind of much more convinced or intrigued, I should say, by the second type of approach, which I guess the person that's probably had more influence on me than anyone else in that respect is George Akerlof. But we think of culture much more as socially determined values and preferences. And that's what I'm going to focus on, how we could go about creating a model of that and why I think it enriches our understanding of institutional dynamics. I don't need to say this almost, but outside of economics, of course, culture rules. I mean, many explanations in sociological thinking, so if you go back and read the great sociologists like Durkheim or Weber or Polanyi, and you look at their accounts of long-run economic change, they're basically stories about how cultural dynamics have changed the way economic relations function. They kind of put culture before economics in the sense that many of the things we see are the products of certain kinds of cultural evolutionary change. So we're probably the only social science that has not fully embraced the idea of culture. Almost every other discipline within social science, somewhere or another, has a central place in its teaching and research for thinking about cultural change. In politics, and that's most relevant to the specific example I want to develop in a minute, is the work of Lipset and Armand and Werber, who, this was work that was done mainly in the 1950s and 60s, put culture absolutely the center of understanding political systems and the way they work. And some of it was based on survey data and other things. This wasn't just armchair reasoning. This was trying to go out and look at people's political attitudes and think about what that was reflecting, particularly the work by Armand and Werber. Of course, if you study organizational behavior, or you think about organizational behavior, work on culture is everywhere. The work, again, I've been influenced by, and another work I've been doing with Torsten, is the work by Ashforth and Mayle, which is very similar to the work that Akerlof and Cranton have done on identity. They think of organizations as vehicles for creating and maintaining particular forms of identity. So, think of iEA today. We're trying to create a certain sense of identity among those who are here to think that they belong to a particular global community. And effective organizations have the power, through either narrative, as George talked about, or other ways of trying to get people to feel like they belong to a community in a particular way. And again, many economists just kind of feel uneasy when things are described in this way. But I don't think anyone who listened to George's talk earlier in the week would have been anything other than completely compelled, I'm sure. And among the straight organizational behavior guys, the guys who study firms, there's just a load of stuff. The work that's off the scale influential outside of economics is the work by Geert Hofstetter. For those who don't know that work, he has various books on this, including the one whose title I like the most, called Software of the Mind, where he thinks of culture as kind of things you download to be kind of mental programs in your mind, and you kind of acquire them from forms of social interaction. Anyway, that work came out of studying IBM. So he had this idea of taking a global firm, namely IBM, and surveying workers in different countries, all working for the same organization, and spotting all of these differences. Particularly, he used things like the difference between individualism and collectivism in the way people organize their productive lives. And this work has had a huge influence, but mainly outside of economics. So I'll briefly talk about some building blocks, then I'll introduce a particular approach, and I'll describe it very quickly. I have one equation in the whole talk, so I'll get to my one equation, and then I'll show you a bit of data, and then we'll wrap up. So the building blocks that I want to describe, actually, that should say values, preferences, and identity. I forgot to edit that. There's the sort of narrow view of preference in economics, which, how much do I prefer, Pepsi to Coke or whatever it might be, these sort of things which are infinitely rich that we all have, that mean we have different consumption bundles, and that's kind of what I call sort of standard preference. But one thing that's very interesting is to think about what gets described outside of economics as values. And I think of values, it's not a hard and fast distinction, but values are those things which are more about abstract ideals. They're things we care about how the world works, which we may or may not be influenced by. We may feel pain when we see a country with a democratic set of institutions being dismantled because we have democratic values, and we think that in an abstract sense. We could be sitting in a country in the world where we are totally unaffected by that. And our values, therefore, are much more about these abstract preferences around how the world should work. And I think we need to explore that idea more in economics. I'm not going to say anything deep about that now, but I do think that's an area of interest. Now, if you go to your sociological accounts of values, particularly Max Weber would be a very good source. He talked about values as giving rise to a certain form of intrinsic motivation. That because we have values, we behave in particular ways. We might join protests, or we might write letters to our member of parliament, or whatever it would be, because we are expressing our values through our behavior. And he used this term, "wert rational," to describe a particular form of behavior, which I think is best thought of as intrinsic motivation as expressive of value. And again, that's not an idea that's really very much in economics. Maybe it could be, maybe it couldn't, but in our model, we sort of interpret the way we model this as a kind of form of Weberian wert rational behavior. Where I think another good example, by the way, which intersects with the identities thing that Weber had, was the emergence of the professions. How do we think of a set of professional norms and values? And he observed that people who become part of an identified profession begin to almost subconsciously behave in particular ways that they identify with the norms and values of that profession. And that very much links to the work on identity. Identity is a particular way of thinking about this, that we absorb these identities and they become part of us, and that we define ourselves and our behavior is influenced by them. And as I say, that also in the organizational behavior literature. Sorting becomes incredibly important in a world where you think cultural evolution might be an important force. Who do you mix with? And of course, there's a massive literature in economics now, a really rich literature on network formation. But how that network formation impinges on these cultural dynamics, I think, has not really been studied a great deal. There's a question about who are your cultural parents. Well, I suppose I would say, Amartya Sen is one of my cultural parents. He instilled in me a set of values around how economics should be studied. And so you can have your biological parents, but you can equally have cultural parents, people who've been particularly influential in the way you both acquire and then express values. And they could be parents, teachers, they could be your boss. And again, it makes you, in a world where you're thinking of cultural transmission, some of those forces could be more or less important for different dimensions of culture. And then, of course, there's horizontal, that's kind of like vertical transmission from a mentor to a mentee. It could be you acquire these dynamics work through networks of friends or classmates or whatever else will be. And again, these are areas that people are beginning to, within economics, explore, I think, a great deal, but we haven't kind of got the integrated whole to think about how this fits into our views about the way societies evolve dynamically. Also important when you begin to study this is the process of socialization. How is it that you get some kind of transmission of values taking place. Vecina and Verdier have a range of really important work, but it's very classically economic in the sense they view cultural dynamics as strategic forward-looking behavior. So I spend a certain amount of time, maybe I have a child, and I want my child to have certain values, perfectly reasonable thing to want, and so I strategically invest in those values based on some calculus, exactly as we would standardly do it in economics. Outside of economics, that approach is much less popular, indeed I would say close to absent. It's much more thought of as a process of unconscious social influence. So as you begin to listen to people, to reason with them, to interact with them, you begin through a process of absorption that's very hard to model in any non-trivial way. And again, it comes back to George talked about narratives. I think narratives are very important. You maybe listen to certain narratives among people around you, and that leads you to think about the world differently. I should say, in sort of a modeling sense, I was most influenced by the work by Guth and Yari when I came to this area, who think of ultimately this as embodied in the values and preferences. So they wrote down models of dynamic value and preference change through group interaction, and but through kind of unconscious influence. So there is a payoff relevance. If behaving in a particular way constantly costs me in terms of my payoffs, I may reevaluate whether I'm doing the right thing or not. So you can bring in economic ideas and link it back to evolutionary models as in population genetics. Because if you recall, for those of you who studied population genetics, at the end of the day, the notion of fitness that has been developed and been most effective in understanding how non-human societies have evolved genetically is essentially which forms of genetic composition give rise to greatest fitness, is essentially defined by the capacity to sustain your life in order to mate and to create more genetic offspring. So the notion of fitness still plays a role, but as a kind of modified node, a more economistic node. And in fact, in the work I've been doing, I think of it more like psychological fitness. To what extent are you absorbing an identity or type with which you're comfortable compared to other types that you might be? And a type is more psychologically fit to the extent that those who absorb that type, on average, have a higher propensity to be happy with that type, I suppose you could say in a crude way. So you can define fitness not necessarily in the classic population genetic sense. You can define it either materially, people who get most money, or it could be people who are just happier. You can think of alternative ways of modeling this, but they are available. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to very briefly report on a particular research project with Torsten, which comes back to my how can we understand dynamic institutions, and I'm going to try and show you how bringing in a role for this cultural dynamics through the evolution of values can allow us to think about those political dynamics. And what we view ourselves as doing is kind of building a bridge between the cultural traditions of other social sciences and the strategic traditions of economists. And we kind of have cherry-picked the bits we like from both of these traditions. So we still have strategic behavior. We still have people behaving rationally in the context of their preferences. But we have this intermediated by a process of cultural dynamics. So we're adding some richness, we think, to that. And it's a very simple view. This is very similar to the way the work, for example, of Asimoglu and Robinson and others who've looked at strategic investment in institutions model it. There's some incumbent elite that has to choose some institutions, and we're going to talk about two dimensions of institutions because we did this work on state capacity where we thought it was very important. The sort of the stuff that affects political replacement. What affects political replacement is executive recruitment rules in the polity data, or some method of how easy is it really to get rid of a guy who you don't like, and how precarious is the hold-on power of a particular incumbent. That's one dimension of institutions that we want to study. Insofar it has institutional foundations, like opening up a system of elections generally is going to cause greater precariousness in terms of hold-on power for the incumbent elite, as we've seen through history. As you extend the franchise, groups that perhaps before have privileged access to power have less of that access to power. And then the other dimension of institutions is constraints on the executive. Once you get into power, how constrained are you in the use of that power? And we then have a fairly standard sets of assumptions, and we're going to use this, we think, to explain the data. Well, before I get to what the data are and why I think they need explaining, Let me just tell you what we get out of the theory. We'll get a theory which gives respect to history dependence, particularly things that people have debated, colonial origins of institutions, democratic capital, I explained that was. We have the notion, which is very popular in sociological reasoning, that there are certain critical junctures in the history of a country which, if it goes in a particular direction at those junctures, will have long-run consequences. And we'll show we have a, albeit quite stylized role for critical junctures in the framework. We think it provides a different perspective on the resource curse, which I'll explain to you when I get there. It has different kinds of institutional reforms, what we think of as defensive versus offensive reforms, and most importantly, and I'll come to this now, allows us to interpret the institution. Oh, I should just give you a couple of quotes though, which we quite like, on these two different views of the dynamics of institutions. This sort of more sociological view, Montesquieu, Lipset, Almond and Weber, and this is a wonderful quote from Seymour Martin Lipset, which is about his view about what sustains democracy. It couldn't be more perfect. This is a kind of cultural view. If a political system is not characterized by a value system allowing the peaceful play of power, there can be no stable democracy. And contrast that with the quote from our good friends Darren and Jim. During the 19th century, most Western societies extended voting rights. These political reforms can be viewed as strategic decisions by the political elite to prevent widespread social unrest and revolution. It's sort of a bit of a sort of wishy-washy, middle-of-the-road place to be, but we actually think both of these guys have something going for them, but we think they're not talking to each other, and we think putting the insights together can deliver. What we're going to do, very briefly talk about a few facts to try and convince you that this isn't just sort of pulling a rabbit out of a hat. For those of you who've never looked at patterns of long-run political institutional change, you can go, and everyone does, download the Polity4 database. It has faults, and there are other alternatives, but by and large, if you're going to look at long-run patterns of change, it's as good as it gets. We're going to look at two dimensions. I could defend this a lot better than I'm going to. We're going to use the measure of executive constraints, which comes from there, which by and large means two things. Do you have a functioning independent judiciary, and do you have a set of parliamentary institutions that has real disciplining effect on the executive? And we've seen a perfect example of that recently with Donald Trump and his attempt to use executive orders to change immigration policy, which was rejected through judicial independence. So the US rightly gets the score of 7 on this. Basically, even though you're popularly elected as a leader, that you have to operate within a quite constrained environment. Openness of executive recruitment is essentially a measure of how easily you can be kicked out of power. Presidential systems on the whole struggle to do well on this. I won't get started on presidential systems, it's a particular bugbear of mine, but the fact is parliamentary systems provide a much better check on power, on openness of executive recruitment, because you can get rid of the Prime Minister by one vote on one day in the Parliament and you're done. Imagine if Trump had to be beholden to Congress for actually holding the presidency, he'd been long gone by now. So you do get a bit of insulation and a bit of course, he has to come up for re-election after 4 years, and he will have to face an open election. At the other extreme, you have sort of hereditary monarchy, and then in the middle, you have sort of other kinds of regimes. So what is the history of institutional reform? What we're going to do is take the 50 countries that have been in the polity data since 1875 and look at what's happened to them. Basically, the story is that you'll see it in a minute, there has been a movement towards both strong executive constraints and executive recruitment. But that is a very a stochastic pattern, in a way I'll show you. A lot of countries move in and out of having strong executive constraints. Indeed, the largest group is going to be the group that has very mixed histories that have moved back and forth. Relatively few have had a smooth transition, getting strong executive constraints and maintaining that forever. That's a very unusual pattern. Also relatively unusual is having executive constraints, abandoning them, staying that forever. There's a whole bunch of countries, though, that have just never had strong executive constraints. I'm not going to make a big deal out of this, but most countries tend to introduce open executive recruitment before they acquire strong executive constraints. And the richer theory, which I'm not going to discuss today, tries to get at that. So here's the history of the world. The left hand is the 50 countries that were in the data in 1875. Nothing particularly surprising about this. There's a general upward trend in these two kinds of democratic institutions, if you want to use that term. There's the kind of democratic recession that took place around the Second World War, and then a continuation, and then most of the countries in Eastern Europe are not in that left-hand panel, but you get some move up. But the thing that's noticeable here is how fast executive constraints have lagged behind openness. A much smaller proportion of countries, even today, something of the order of a little over 50% of those 50 countries has strong executive constraints, whereas almost 90-odd% of them have open executive recruitment. So there is a real difference in these institutions, and if you believe the kind of reasoning in my work with Torsten, you would also believe that these things have very different implications for state development. I'll skip that. You can just, I mean, you're not going to be able to read this probably at the distance you are, but basically all we do is list all these countries. The thing I want you to notice is the kind of density mass in the middle. These are all the countries that are moving in and out. Then you have your sort of countries with stable transitions on the right, and your countries with stable, either never having entered strong executive constraints like Afghanistan or China on the left, and then you get a couple of countries, Ethiopia and Liberia, that once in their history did have strong executive constraints but abandoned them. Similar thing for openness, and openness again, the vast majority of countries are in the churning category. They may come out of churning, they may make one or two transitions and eventually move in a particular direction. Let's not look at that. Now what about values? Well, the obvious place to look is in the World Values Survey. Some of you, or many of you, will be familiar with the World Values Survey. It's being used increasingly by economists. There's a question in there. You can use a couple of different questions, but the one we use here is the importance, how do you rate the importance of democracy on a 10-point scale? The mean of that is quite high, actually 8.58, and I'm going to show you stuff deviations from world means. The thing that won't surprise you is after you control for everything you can in the data, there are distinct differences across countries. What to make of those isn't entirely clear. But also interesting is that values seem to be systematically correlated with institutional history. So this, I hope you can see this, but basically what it is the aggregate, the proportion of people who have strong support for democratic institutions graphed against the amount of time, the proportion of years since 1800 that these countries have had either strong executive constraints or openness. And there's whichever way you cut it, there's a positive relationship. In other words, countries with longer democratic histories appear to have more support. Now, of course, what I've been trying to describe to you is a model that says you simply can't think of these two things as causally related. Values and institutions work together. They co-evolve. It's not that culture determines institutions or vice versa. You need a theory with the both going on. This I particularly enjoyed the first time I saw that on my computer screen. All I did was to collapse the data by these three types of countries. Those with mixed histories, those with always having had weak executive constraints, and always those with have strong executive constraints. And I've just done it in deviations from means. And you can see the countries that have always had strong executive constraints or made a single transition towards it that's stable have much stronger democratic values than the other countries. And the weakest democratic values come in the countries that have always had weak executive constraints. Again, nothing about causality here, but it seemed to me to be kind of smoke, if not fire. Okay, the last thing I'll do is briefly describe the theoretical framework and the way we go about modeling this, and then I'll wrap up. So as I said earlier, we have a model in which an incumbent elite can choose policies and institutions. Some institutions weaken the position of the incumbent. May make it more likely that the incumbent is going to lose power, and may make it mean that the incumbent has to share resources on a more equitable basis with the citizens. And by and large, if incumbents are selfish, then they're going to resist changes that mean they're more likely to lose power and they're more likely to have to share resources. And of course, that's not desirable for the non-elite groups. The non-elite groups would like to have the institutions that can allow you to take a greater share of power and also give you a greater share of resources. So a very stylized model of institutional constraints there. What we suppose, and this is very similar to, say, the Acemoglu-Robinson work, is that what constrains institutional choice is the possibility of citizen protest. And we think of this as a kind of developed civil society, which means if you go against what your citizens want, they're going to come out and protest. And in the limit, they might even try and force a revolution and try and get rid of the incumbent by those kind of means. But the government can invest in repressing such protests. And indeed, we see on a regular basis, sadly, large amounts of investment in repression by governments that want to change institutions or maintain institutions which allow them either to stay in power or to have more power, face fewer constraints. And there are potentially protests, but governments in many countries, and one can think of examples, have been quite brutal in repressing such protests. But this power struggle is what determines which institutions are chosen. So we have a very classical notion of a power struggle, and that has to be resolved. Either the citizens get institutions closer to what they want, or the elite get to maintain the institutions which are closer to what they want. So what's the role of values here? The role of values is determining the strength of civil society, to put it crudely. We have a model in which we think about citizens we call concerned citizens. Concerned citizens are those that have values, that believe in the protection of democratic institutions, like the guys in the survey who say they believe strongly. Now, there is a correlation. Actually, it turns out in the World Value Survey there is a question on whether or not you've ever joined a political protest. And there is a correlation between that and strength of democratic values. So it's not an entirely silly way to think about this. We think of them as forming a civil society. And this isn't going to mean a lot, but this is kind of the cool thing that comes out of any model of using replicator. The replicator dynamic is a kind of core dynamic in the population genetics literature to describe the evolution of phenotypes in a population where there's some potential advantage to one type over another. Here we think of this as psychological fitness. To what extent do the concerned citizens actually have a fitness advantage over the non-concerned citizens? So one way to think about that is if you're the type that cares greatly about this stuff and you're out there protesting but you're constantly being repressed by the regime, over time your parents may even say, look, I really don't want my kids to be like this because all they're going to do is get in trouble. They'll spend their lives as political prisoners or whatever could be the extreme version of that. So psychological fitness in some way can shape this process of cultural evolution is the way we think about it. And so if you have a strong civil society because of the protest mechanism, that's going to give you support for democratic institutions. If you have a weak civil society, that's going to support autocratic institutions. And countries in the middle are going to zigzag depending on the kinds of shocks they face. So these could be resource shocks, these could be shocks to political networks. There's a variety of ways of modeling those shocks. But they're going to be the countries that we saw in the data who are moving back and forth. And it turns out a model like this, with a replicator dynamic like this, and it's very easy to see, has two very natural steady states. What does this equation give you? It tells you the change in the proportion of the people who are trying to uphold democratic values in the population is the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is this slightly mysterious functional form, but it has a mu into 1 minus mu. One thing you'll spot absolutely immediately, oh, this thing has a 0 in two places. It has a 0 when mu is 0, and it has a 0 when mu is 1. This thing will have a stationary point at two places. It naturally gives way to two steady states. And it turns out in a variety of models, the middle steady state is unstable. So societies will either settle at a fully democratic steady state or a fully autocratic one, but they may churn quite a bit. And there'll be a tipping point in mu space at which if you get to that tipping point, you're going to converge to the good steady state. And and to the left of that tipping point, you're going to go to the undemocratic steady state. So this model gives you a very simple dynamic in which values are evolving according to a specifically defined process. One more comment, and then I'll kind of get to the punchline, is that the delta is our measure of psychological fitness. That depends on institutions. So if you're living in a world where people who support democratic institutions are feeling good about that, they're psychologically fit, meaning they're living in the kind of society that they value and they like, that's going to be like having delta of mu positive, and that's then going to positively feed back. You get a positive complementarity in this world between the values and the institutions. So the more democratic the society is, the harder it would be for an incumbent to abandon democratic institutions, and as you go down the equilibrium path, you get this positive dynamic. And that's what drives the dynamics to one of these corner solutions. And you can always get rid of that, by the way. I'm giving you a very stylized model. It's just as in some genetic traits are more or less things to which humans have converged, like having 10 toes or whatever it would be. Other things like eye color, you don't ever get to a steady state where one particular type dominates over another. And you can write down models of replicated dynamics that can give you different solutions for different kinds of cultural traits. Can this help us think about these issues? Well, it gives you a very natural way of thinking of critical junctures. What happens to you on or around a tipping point can have long-run consequences for the dynamic path that your society takes. Equally, you can explain or think about gradualist paths to democracy, like the kind we had in my country, where Parliament gradually began to take control over the monarch as there was a slow period of transition towards democratic institutions, alongside the development, if you believe the model. We have no way of testing it. They didn't have the World Value Survey in 1600, sadly. But along a path where our values are evolving. There's some sort of, again, you can tie this back to some very interesting work by typically cultural historians on changing attitudes towards democracy in different parts of Europe. The big story was secularization of political authority. You had huge amounts of influence of religion on the way societies were organized. So in Britain, there was a big tussle between the Pope and the King, which eventually led to the King deciding he wanted to exit from the Church of Rome. And that ultimately led to a different dynamic path, because you kind of had much more secularization of authority. So there's a lot been written about this. But in different countries, to different degrees, European Enlightenment had different patterns of influence on the way elites, in particular, thought about democratic institutions. And we think that heterogeneity could have been a very important part of why there was change. But it's very hard. These are long-run periods of change. I think to say you could ever write down a test of a model like this, I think would be a huge exaggeration. The model naturally suggests why you could have a political resource curse. Governments that have access to large amounts of resources are going to have the power to resist, to repress, and also the power and also the incentive to stay in power. Now that's very standard. Everyone knows that. The model has the auxiliary prediction that resource-intensive economies should also give way to weaker democratic values. And I'm going to show you, my final table will be to show you some correlations that shows that's indeed the case, that oil-rich countries tend to have, on average, weaker democratic values in the population than do non-resource. The other thing that we were kind of interested in, got interested in very quickly when we wrote down this framework, which we hadn't really explored before, was how you could think about foreign influence, because you can't talk about the history of democratization around the world without thinking about the amount of foreign influence on that. Periods of colonialism, military occupation, or occupation in the form of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, these were all very powerful examples of imposition of particular institutional arrangements on society. Now, the classic view would be to see it just as institutional influence, but there's the possibility that this thing can have deep-seated cultural influence, and again, that's something we can look at in the data. The other obvious thing to think about in this model is military support as a source of change, because if it's the case you can only keep institutions with a particular configuration because you have the power to repress, it may be that some government's willing to offer you that power and to increase the possibility of you resisting political change. But again, standard view would say that's just about institutions. This richer view says it might have something then to do with the subsequent evolution of values. Another area that you can explore, which is a more direct influence, indirect influence on values, is the role of migration. Is it the case that if populations move, they either carry their values and therefore have an impact on the societies to which they move, that could again have an effect on the direction of the institutions of that society? And then the other area, which is talked about a great deal outside of economics, is this concept of cultural spillovers and soft power, the idea that you can influence at a distance the institutional pattern of change quite consciously. Some governments invest huge amounts in Britain still has a sort of delusion of empire when it comes to these things, because the British government invests a huge amount in the BBC World Service. It's a very controversial issue. They have abandoned services in certain languages around the world. But by and large, the British government subsidizes huge amounts of foreign language broadcasting using various wavebands that can be received around the world. And the argument is that this is a kind of form of an attempt to influence through what's called soft power. So, and of course, the internet gives rise to all manner of possibilities in regard to this. So I'll just show you this table, which again you probably can't read, but I'll tell you what it says. What we did is we took those data on values, we regressed them on whether you're an oil-rich country, and as you might expect, you have a negative coefficient. Whether you were subject to Soviet influence, so people who now live in countries that have previously been part of the Soviet sphere systematically have weaker democratic values, as expressed in the World Values Survey. And we're controlling for a whole bunch of characteristics here. Interesting, though, if you were occupied by Nazi Germany, you actually tend on average to have stronger democratic values. Well, why is that? A lot of the countries that were occupied by Nazi Germany, like Norway would be a good example, had already evolved strong institutions prior to Nazi occupation. So actually, on average, the Nazis occupied countries that were already strongly institutionalized. And on average, they tend to be countries with stronger democratic values today. And then finally, to humor my great friends Jim and Darren, since this otherwise might seem to be a bit threatening, as I've suggested to some of what they've done, I put in settler mortality into this regression. And lo and behold, it turns out that countries with very high settler mortality tend to have weaker democratic values. Again, the conventional view would just be have something going directly through institutions. This gives you a kind of notion of something that could be operating through this other mechanism. Okay, so I won't really bore you with this. I mean, this is phase 5, question mark. You know, maybe this will go somewhere, maybe it won't. I've got probably 5 or 6 papers now, broadly part of this agenda, two of them with Torsten. One thing that I'm working on actually at the moment, using some of these ideas, is looking at dynamics of inequality, particularly norms of equality within organizations and how they evolve as a kind of process of cultural dynamics. There's lots of areas, I think, where one can, with the structure of specific models, which of course makes you a total prisoner, because once you write down a model, you know, you kind of lose the capacity to talk about things with your hands sort of waving through. Yeah, it didn't stop me then, but anyway, in general, it stops you talking about things in a hand-waving way. So I think there's the possibility of having a disciplined research agenda here. Now, whether it'll lead anywhere, we won't know. I mean, coming to Danny's talk yesterday, here's another sort of cast off to the set of models that economists have. Until we've tried them out sufficiently well and tried to make them work and tried to test some of their implications, we have actually no idea whether they'll actually work. But I think that I hope, if I've done nothing else, I hope I've at least opened the possibility that there is scope for bringing in cultural dynamics in a very simple way. You don't have, like, I have a sort of rule of thumb: if I can solve a model, anyone can solve a model, and these are models that even I can solve. So these are absolutely simple, straightforward approaches that I think have the potential, at least, to illuminate certain things that we care about and to be part of the debating tools of economics. Thank you very much. Okay, there's no Q&A, so don't worry, you're going to be kept